So now we've learned a lot about how functions work in JavaScript. Let's take a look at some practical examples. So now we've learned a little bit about functions, and that's really good because now we can start learning some about JavaScript in the browser. Now this badge is really more about JavaScript the language, and we've been avoiding actually browser-specific code in a large part because the browser code that we use to interact with the page, even though we interact with it through JavaScript, is a completely different subject. The way we interact with a page is through a series of functions and objects that are defined in the environment of our browser that we interact with. And it's very complex and it differs from browser to browser. Now, that's where a lot of the headache in JavaScript programming comes from, cross-browser compatibility, and what we're calling the Document Object Model, or DOM. And that DOM is what I was talking about. It's the interface we have to the actual elements on our page. It's how we could manipulate the contents of a div, or change a style, or add or remove elements. We aren't going to be going in depth in these examples. I'm going to show you some very basic things, and they will work in at least this browser. But I just want to show you how we can use JavaScript to interact with a page. Now, to make our lives easier, to smooth out the difference between the different browsers, and to make the whole interacting with the page much more enjoyable, we have libraries like jQuery. Now, jQuery is just JavaScript code that's been written to take into account all of the differences between browsers and provide useful and easy-to-use functions like we've created here that allow us to manipulate the page without worrying about all of this stuff we're about to see right here. So if we take a look at our page, we have a button and we have an input. And those are the two things I'm going to be mainly dealing with in our code. If we look at the HTML, I've added an ID property to each of these two elements. And that's because an ID is the easiest way to retrieve an element and store it into a JavaScript variable. So let's take a look here. I want to be able to hold an object that represents my button from inside my JavaScript program. So we'll start off with our normal var keyword, and let's store it into a variable called button. And now this is where we get into the document object model. And I'm going to explain this briefly, but this will be a whole nother set of videos and a whole nother badge that we'll be going over in a little bit. And the way we interact or get this button off of the page is through an object that's available from our browser called the document. Now, document isn't part of the JavaScript language, but it is part of JavaScript's DOM, or the environment that you'll be using JavaScript inside the browser. Now, if you're using JavaScript in another environment, like in Node.js, document won't be defined. You'll notice that my text editor here has highlighted the word document because it is part of the DOM and is recognized, but is not a language feature. Rather, it's just a variable that's used in the browsers. And this is where we can get our elements off of the page. Document.getElement by ID. This is a method that's exposed to us by the browser. And this is a pretty common method. This is pretty much usable in any browser, and there's not a whole lot of cross-browser quirks associated with it. The syntax is it's a method, so we'll use parentheses to call it, just like a normal function. And then we pass it the ID of the element we want to get. Again, you'll remember I gave IDs to these functions because I want to use getElement by ID. And I gave the button the ID of action. So if I do action here, now we have stored into button our actual button that's on the page. However, there is one thing we need to do. Let's take a look at this real quick. Now I've refreshed the page and I have a variable called button, and you'll see it auto-completed because it's set. But what happens when we evaluate it? It's null. It's not undefined, it's null, which means we didn't get our button object stored into button. And that's for a very simple reason. As soon as we load this script tag, it runs our code. And our code is looking for an element with an ID of action. But if we look at the order of our code, our browser hasn't actually gotten to that code yet, so there is no button on the page when we call it. And that's where you'll see things like document.ready coming into place. That comes from jQuery, which means that it actually waits to execute some code that you store in an anonymous function, and it waits until the entire page is loaded up and everything is ready to go. Now we could do that, but the easiest way to fix this is we will take our script and put it at the bottom of our page. So now, by the time we call script, our button with the ID of action and our input have been added to the page. And when we call this code immediately, it will be able to find the element with the ID of action. So if we save everything out and refresh, now we can look at the button. You'll see that the console is printed out as the HTML that defines the button. And in fact, if I mouse over it, it'll actually show me where on the page it is. Now this button is what we call a DOM element. Now there are some properties and methods to manipulate this button. Let's go ahead and grab our input. And I'm going to store that into input. And we have the ID of text field. And so if we refresh, we can get button, and we have our text field. And there we go. Now the way we interact with a page is we can do things like console.log or take actions right from within our main content right here. But remember, this is all executed as soon as the script loads. Usually when we want to interact with a page, it has to do with some sort of user interaction or some other cue like a timer going off, or maybe some input coming in from the server, which means that we have to have some way to hold on to that code and call it when that particular event happens. Well, that's exactly what functions are for. We can store code in them and hold on to them until we want to use them. So let's say we want to do something when we click this button. So right now, nothing happens when we click it. Let's do a very simple example. Now what we could do is say button, and this is not the preferred way to do this, but this is actually one of the oldest and most compatible ways, but it's not ideal for a few reasons. But let's take a look. We'll say button.onClick equals, and this is setting what we call a property on the button. It's like a variable that's associated with that button instance. So a button has a property called onClick, and what we're going to do is assign it a value. And this is going to be a function. Now we could give it a named function, but we could also do this anonymous. So we could say button.onClick equals function, and we'll say console.log clicked. And now what we've done is by assigning to this special onClick event, the browser is going to tell you when it's clicked by calling this function. So if we refresh, silly me, I forgot parentheses there. Forgot what language I was in for a moment. And so now we have console.log and clicked. There we go, that should work. So now we don't see anything, but when we click it, we can see that we're getting clicked logged. And console.log, if it gets the same message over and over again, we'll just put this counter in front of it so it doesn't fill up your scroll space. If you add a value in, it'll continue adding that clicked console.log. So that's great, but it's not ideal. What if we wanted two things to happen when we call onClick? Let's say we wanted to have another output here, and we'll say other click listener. Well, if we refresh, we only get the one from the other click listener, and that's because onClick can only hold one thing. We assign it here, but then we reassign the value, and that means onClick can only hold one thing, which isn't ideal. So we have another model that we can use, but this is a little more problematic because it works in most browsers except one, and that one is called Internet Explorer. And it has a slightly different model, and we're not going to get into the different ways of dealing with it. So the code I'm going to show you now works in most browsers besides IE. So instead of doing button.onClick with our function, we're going to call a different method called addEventListener. And this takes a few arguments, the first of which is the event we want to listen for, in our case, click. And this is a special event keyword, click, meaning when somebody clicks it, we're going to call this function right here. And I'm just going to use the same anonymous function. We can pass that as a parameter here. So this is our second parameter, and we need to close it. So now we have our opening parentheses for our addEventListener call. Takes two arguments. First, a string calling our type of event, and the second is our function to be called when that happens. Now, if we were to save this code out and refresh, we'll actually see that both of them are called. That's because add_event_listener doesn't interact with onClick. Instead, it works in a different way where we can add as many listeners as we'd like. So we don't want to use onClick because it's not as flexible. So we'll just say other click. So now by adding event listeners, we can add as many listeners we want to our button's click event, and they'll all be called. Now, what if in one of these we want to, let's say, manipulate the value of input? So we can say input.setAttribute. And the attribute we want to change what's inside of an input is the value attribute. And then we'll just say what we want the value to be. We'll say hello world. So our first click listener just does console.log clicked, and our second one does another console.log other click, but it also interacts with a different DOM element on the page by calling another special method called setAttribute. We're setting the attribute value to hello world. And so if we click it, we can see not only did we get our console.logs, but now we're actually interacting with the page. We can change what's inside of it. Now, this is just a very basic example. Again, there is so much to consider while actually dealing with the DOM elements. For instance, add_event_listener won't work in some browsers. setAttribute may act differently or not how we want it. This is just a basic example of showing you why functions are so important in JavaScript, because everything that we do is pretty much associated with some event, and the only way to store the code until we actually want to use it is to store it into a function. And whether it's anonymous or a named function, we could have passed instead a variable that holds a function instead of this anonymous function. But ultimately, that's how we interact with our page. Again, in the later badges, we'll see how to interact with the pages in a more meaningful way. But now you should have an idea of what JavaScript can do to actually interact with a page. We can listen for events as well as modify elements on the page. So we've learned how to use functions, how to use arguments and return values, and how scope and anonymous functions make our code easier to read.